When Mary Thompson left her husband's house in the morning, the air was filled with that particular silence that portends heavy snowfall. She stood in the doorway of the wooden structure on the western outskirts of Willow Creek. Beside her was her daughter Sophie, both dressed in layers of wool and patched cotton that had been mended so often the original fabric had become a matter of speculation. Mary's husband John had never raised a hand to them, but his neglect had become so deep and his indifference so complete that the house had turned into a place where warmth could not take root. He spent his days in town, his evenings somewhere else, and his earnings on pursuits that did not include bread or firewood. Mary had made her decision in the cold hours before dawn: better to face winter head-on than to freeze gradually in a place that pretended to be home. She took only what could be carried: one blanket, a frying pan, a knife, flint and steel, and a small sack of cornmeal she had hidden under the floorboards. Sophie, 7 years old and already accustomed to silence, carried her bundle. Without questions, they walked north along the frozen cart path, their breath billowing white until the land began to rise and the trees thickened into groves of pine and oak. By midday, they reached the old Whitaker farm, an abandoned homestead left years ago when illness had taken the family. The barn still stood, though its roof sagged and the boards had split under the weight of successive winter's snow had drifted high against the north wall, and icicles thick as a man's wrist hung from the eaves. Mary circled the structure slowly, her boots crunching over the crust until she noticed a depression in the ground at the south corner of the barn. She dropped to her knees and brushed away the snow with bare hands, revealing a wooden hatch in the ground. Its frame weathered but intact, the hinges resisted, then yielded with a groan, and she peered into the darkness. The air that rose from below was cold but sheltered from the wind. She struck a match and held it to the opening. The flame illuminated a passage descending into packed earth, the walls shored up with roughly hewn beams, and beyond it a low room dug into the soil. Mary descended the wooden ladder first, the match flame casting shadows that danced across walls of brown packed earth. The room was roughly 12 feet across and 8 feet deep, its ceiling vaulted and reinforced with crude stone blocks and salvaged brick laid in uneven courses. The floor was bare earth, damp and scattered with old straw that had rotted into dark humus. Roots protruded from the earthen walls in tangled knots, and the air smelled of clay and ancient coal. At the far end, a narrow corridor stretched toward the barn's foundation, its mouth exhaling a faint draft that carried the scent of snow. Mary set down the spent match and climbed back up, calling quietly for Sophie. The girl descended carefully, her small hands gripping each rung. Upon reaching the bottom, she stood close to her mother. Saying nothing, Mary struck another match and surveyed the space with the methodical gaze of a woman accustomed to solving problems with limited means. The first task was light. She sent Sophie up to search the barn while she cleared the worst of the debris from the floor, raking the rotted straw into a pile with the edge of her boots. Sophie returned with a rusted lantern she had found hanging on a nail, its glass chimney intact and a small reserve of kerosene still sloshing in the base. Mary trimmed the wick with her knife, struck the flint and steel, and lit the lantern. The flame caught and swelled, filling the room with warm amber light that pushed the shadows into the corners. She set the lantern on the floor and looked at Sophie. "We need firewood," she said. "Gather as much as you can carry. Stay within sight of the barn." Sophie nodded and climbed the ladder again, her movements quick and sure. Mary remained below, studying the vault of the ceiling and the texture of the walls, her mind already constructing the sequence of tasks that would turn this dugout cellar into a place where two people could survive the winter. The first priority was warmth. Without it, they would not last the night. Mary examined the corridor at the back of the room and found it opened into a second smaller space, a storage niche dug into the hillside, its walls lined with shelves that had long since collapsed. The draft she had felt came from a crack in the ceiling where the earth had settled and fractured, creating a natural gap leading to the surface. She returned to the main room and began gathering stones from the floor and edges of the space. Piling them in the corner where the earth was driest, she laid them in a circle, layering carefully to form a simple hearth, then lined the interior with flat stones to protect the soil beneath from the heat. When Sophie returned with an armload of dry branches, Mary took them and began building a fire, starting with dry bark and twigs, adding larger pieces. As the flame grew, the smoke rose sluggishly at first, pooling against the vaulted ceiling and filling the room with a gray haze that stung the eyes. Mary watched the smoke's movement, tracing its path as it drifted toward the corridor and then upward through the crack. She climbed the ladder and emerged into the snow, following the line of the crack until she found where the smoke was escaping a narrow fissure in the earth near the barn's foundation. She widened the opening with her hands and the blade of her knife, prying away chunks of frozen soil and stacking them aside. When she returned below, the smoke was rising cleaner, drawn by the draft. She added more wood to the fire and felt the first real warmth begin to spread through the room. Sophie stood by the hearth, her hands extended toward the flame, and Mary placed a hand on her shoulder. "Good work," she said. By dusk, the fire had driven the worst cold from the room, though the damp earth still radiated a chill that penetrated through clothing. Mary spread the blanket on the floor by the hearth and gestured for Sophie to sit. She boiled water in the pan, mixing it with cornmeal to make a thick porridge they ate with their fingers, its warmth settling in their stomachs like stone. When the meal was finished, Mary banked the fire and laid down beside Sophie, pulling the blanket over them. Both the earth beneath was hard and cold, and she could feel the dampness seeping through the fabric. She knew they could not sleep this way for long without inviting illness, but for this night it would suffice. She listened as Sophie's breathing slowed and deepened, then closed her own eyes and let exhaustion take over. She woke once in the night to add wood to the fire, and again before dawn to check the flue. The room was still dark, the lantern having burned through its small reserve of kerosene, but the fire gave enough light to see. She climbed the ladder and emerged into a world transformed. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the ground in a fresh white blanket and burying the hatch under a knee-deep drift. She dug it out with her hands, then stood and surveyed the landscape. The sky was pale and overcast, and the air so cold it hurt to breathe. She returned below and woke Sophie. "We have work," she said. The girl sat up, rubbing her eyes, and reached for the rag doll she had tucked under the blanket. Mary did not tell her to leave it. The second day began with the problem of the floor. Mary woke with a stiff back and aching hips from the cold earth, and she knew they needed a barrier between their bodies and the damp soil. She climbed to the surface and walked to the barn, pushing open the sagging door and stepping into the dim interior. The structure was a ruin, its roof partially collapsed and the walls leaning inward, but the wood was still sound in places. She found a section of interior partition that had come loose and began prying boards free with the claw of a hammer she had found buried in the straw. The wood was old and weathered, gray with age, but dry and free of rot. She carried the boards down to the room one at a time. Sophie followed with smaller pieces. They laid the boards across the floor, fitting them as tightly as the warped planks allowed where gaps remained. Mary stuffed them with dry straw and handfuls of leaves she had gathered from the barn's loft. She pressed the material down with her boot until it formed a tight mat, then laid another layer of boards on top, creating a double floor that raised them several inches above the ground. The difference was immediate. The cold radiating from the earth was blocked, and the air in the room felt degrees warmer. Mary dropped to her knees and ran a hand over the surface, testing the stability, then nodded. "This will hold," she said. Sophie sat on the edge of the new floor and bounced slightly, testing it herself, and Mary saw the faint shadow of a smile on the girl's face. They worked through the afternoon, reinforcing the floor with additional boards and filling the remaining gaps with clay that Mary dug from the corridor and mixed with water. The clay dried slowly in the fire's warmth, hardening into a sealant that locked the cold beneath them. The walls were the next concern. The packed earth was stable, but it wept condensation, and Mary knew the moisture would undermine their warmth and invite mold. She returned to the barn and salvaged more boards along with a coil of rope and a handful of bent nails. She drove stakes into the earth at intervals along the walls, using a flat stone as a hammer, then lashed boards vertically to the stakes, creating a wooden sheathing that stood several inches from the soil. The gap between wood and earth would trap a layer of still air, and that air would act as insulation. Sophie handed her nails one at a time, her small fingers dexterous and careful, and Mary drove them with even strokes. By evening, 3 of the 4 walls were sheathed in wood, and the room began to take on the appearance of an intentional structure rather than a hole in the ground. The fire burned steadily in the stone hearth, and the light from the lantern, refilled with a small amount of kerosene Mary had found in a tin in the barn, cast warm highlights across the rough stone vault of the ceiling. Mary stepped back and studied their work, hands on her hips, and felt a small measure of satisfaction in her chest. They were not safe yet. But they were no longer helpless. She added wood to the fire and gestured for Sophie to sit. "We will eat. Then rest," she said. She boiled water and added a handful of dried beans she had found in a jar in the barn, along with a piece of salt pork, so old it was almost black. The resulting soup was thin and salty but hot, and they drank it from the pan in turns, passing it back and forth until it was gone. On the third day, Mary woke before dawn and climbed to the surface to assess their resources. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped, and the air was so cold it seared the lungs. As she walked the perimeter of the property, her eyes scanning the ground for anything useful, at the east wall of the barn, she found a rusted plow blade and a length of chain. In a collapsed section of roof, she found a sheet of tin, bent and corroded, but still whole. She carried these items to the hatch and lowered them down, then returned to the barn and searched more thoroughly. In a corner buried under straw, she found a wooden crate holding a small sack of flour, a jar of lard, and a tin of tea. The flour was riddled with weevils, but Mary sifted it through her fingers and decided half was still good. She carried the crate to the room and set it on the floor by the lantern. Sophie was on her feet, tending the fire, adding small sticks one at a time. Mary knelt beside her and showed her the flour. "We'll bake bread tonight," she said. Sophie's eyes widened, and Mary saw the hunger there. Sharp and undisguised, she had been rationing food carefully. But the girl was growing, and the cold demanded fuel. Mary mixed the flour with water and a pinch of salt, kneading it on one of the clean boards until a stiff dough formed. She shaped it into a flat round and laid it on a stone by the fire, turning it every few minutes until the surface browned and the inside steamed. They ate the bread while it was still hot, tearing it into pieces and chewing slowly, and Mary felt the warmth from it spread through her body like a blessing. That afternoon, Mary turned her attention to the problem of a bed. Sleeping on the floor, even with the blanket and wooden boards beneath them, left them stiff and cold. Each morning, she needed to raise them higher, to create a space where warm air could circulate beneath their body. She returned to the barn and found a section of wooden fencing that had collapsed into the snow. She cut it into lengths with a handsaw she had salvaged, measuring each against her forearm, then carried the wood to the room. She lashed 4 lengths into a rectangular frame with rope, reinforcing the corners with nails. She set the frame on 4 flat stones, raising it a foot off the ground, then tested the stability by pressing down with her full weight. The frame held. She sent Sophie to the barn for straw, and the girl made 3 trips, her arms full each time, until they had enough to fill the frame. Mary heaped the straw onto the frame, compressing it with her hands until it formed a thick mattress. She spread the blanket over the straw, then added her shawl and Sophie's spare dress to create layers. The bed was crude, but when they tested it that evening, the straw compressed under their weight and held them high enough that the cold from the floor did not reach. Sophie lay down, with the doll tucked under her arm, and Mary sat beside her, adding wood to the fire and watching the shadows dance across the vaulted ceiling. The room was warm now, warmer than it had been since their arrival, and Mary allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had built something from nothing, and it was holding. The 4th day brought a new challenge. The fire, though effective, consumed wood faster than Mary could gather alone, and the smoke, though vented through the crack, still left a haze in the room that coated the throat and made eyes water. Mary studied the hearth and the flow of air, her mind working through the principles she had observed in the chimneys of better-built homes. Heat rises, she knew, and if she could direct it more efficiently, she could reduce the amount of fuel while improving the draw of smoke. She retrieved the sheet of tin from the corner and examined it, turning it in her hands. The metal was thin and coated with rust, but still pliable. She cut it into 2 panels with the edge of the plow blade, scoring the metal and bending until it broke along the line. She positioned the first panel behind the fire, angling it to reflect heat forward into the room. The effect was immediate. The warmth intensified, radiating outward in a way it had not before. She positioned the second panel above the fire, creating a crude chimney throat that directed smoke upward and prevented it from spilling back into the room. The smoke began to rise cleaner, drawn by the enhanced draft. Sophie clapped her hands, and Mary allowed herself a small smile. "Hold this steady," Mary said, handing Sophie the lower panel while she secured it with wire. The girl braced it with both hands, her face serious with concentration, and Mary worked quickly, twisting the wire tight and anchoring it to the stones. When finished, She stepped back and looked at the fire. The flames burned hotter and cleaner, and the smoke rose in a steady column. Disappearing into the crack, without lingering, Mary added a single log to the fire and watched it ignite, the heat rolling forward in waves. "This is good work," she said, and Sophie nodded, her expression solemn. With the fire stabilized, Mary turned her focus to food. The flour and beans would not last, and they needed protein and fat to endure the coldest months. She fashioned a snare from a length of wire found in the barn, bending it into a loop and securing it to a stake. Each morning, she set the snare at the forest edge, checking at midday and again at sunset. On the fifth day, she found a rabbit, its body still warm. Caught by the neck, she carried it to the room and skinned it with her knife. Working carefully to preserve the hide, she stretched the hide on a wooden frame and set it by the fire to dry, knowing it could be sewn into mittens or lining for a coat. She boiled the meat with turnips and onions she had dug from the frozen garden, and the resulting soup was thick and filling, the fat from the rabbit floating on the surface in golden droplets. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, and Mary saved the bones to boil again for broth. She set the snare every day, and over the next week caught 2 more rabbits and a squirrel. She rendered the fat in the pan, pouring it into a tin and storing it in the coolest corner of the room. She used the fat to grease the hinges of the hatch, seal the seams of her boots, and mix with flour for a dense caloric bread that warmed from within. Nothing was wasted. The bones were boiled until they softened, then crushed and mixed with clay to reinforce the hearth. Scraps of meat clinging to bones were scraped off and added to the soup pot. The hides were cleaned, dried, and stored, awaiting sewing. By the end of the second week, the shelter had fallen into a rhythm. Each morning, Mary climbed to the surface to check the weather and gather wood. The snow had deepened, and drifts now reached waist-high in places. But she had learned to read the landscape, to find standing deadwood beneath the snow, and to judge which branches were dry enough to burn. Sophie remained below and tended the fire, adding wood when the flames flagged and sweeping the floor with a bundle of straw tied to a stick. Mary taught her to recognize the signs of a healthy fire: the color of the flames, the sound of the wood as it burned, how the smoke rose cleanly without pooling. The girl learned quickly, her small hands moving with confidence as she adjusted the logs and cleared the ash. In the afternoons, they worked together, improving the shelter. Mary sheathed the remaining wall with boards, filling gaps with clay dug from the corridor, and mixed with water. The clay hardened in the fire's warmth, sealing cracks and further insulating the space. She built a small shelf on the wall, fitting boards without nails. Using notches and friction to hold them in place, she arranged their belongings on the shelf: the flint and steel, the knife, the tin of fat, the cloth with vegetables, so that everything had a place and could be found in darkness. Sophie carved a hook from a branch with Mary's knife, working slowly and carefully, and hung her doll on the wall by the bed. Mary did not tell her to take it down. The doll was a small comfort, and comfort was a resource as valuable as firewood or food. Winter deepened. The snow fell in heavy curtains, and the wind drove drifts high enough to bury the barn entirely. Mary dug out the hatch each morning, her hands raw and red despite the rabbit-skin mittens she had sewn. The temperature above ground dropped so low that breath froze in the lungs, and she learned to work quickly, gathering only what was necessary before retreating below. The shelter, by contrast, remained stable. The fire burned day and night, fed by wood Mary stacked in the corridor, and the mass of earth around them absorbed the heat and radiated it back slowly, creating a warmth that was gentle but persistent. Mary measured the temperature by the feel of the air and the dryness of the walls, adjusting the fire and ventilation to maintain balance. She explained the process to Sophie as they worked, her voice calm and instructive. "Heat rises," she said, "but the earth holds it. The soil is like a blanket. It keeps the warmth from escaping." Sophie listened, her eyes following her mother's hands as Mary adjusted the tin panels and added wood to the fire. "We are not fighting the cold," Mary continued. "We are teaching it to leave us alone." The girl nodded, and Mary saw understanding in her face, a dawning awareness of the principles governing their survival. One morning, Mary climbed the ladder and found the hatch frozen shut. She braced her shoulder and pushed, but the ice held firm. She descended and took the pan, heating it over the fire until the metal glowed, then carried it up and pressed it to the edge of the hatch. The ice hissed and melted, and she pushed again, and this time the hatch yielded. She emerged into a world of white and blue, the sky pale, and the snow so bright it hurt to look at. On the morning of the third Weak Mary climbed to the surface and saw smoke rising in the distance. Thin columns against the pale sky, she shaded her eyes and counted 3 separate fires. All from the direction of Willow Creek. She stood in the snow for a long moment, her breath billowing white, and wondered if her husband was among those warming themselves by those distant hearths. The thought came and went without weight. She had made her choice and had no regrets. She gathered wood and descended, and did not tell Sophie about the smoke that afternoon. She heard voices. She climbed the ladder and opened the hatch, and 3 men stood in the snow, their coats thin and their faces gaunt. She recognized them as townsmen, farmers who worked the land south of the creek. One of them, a man named Thomas Hale, stepped forward. "We heard you were here," he said. His tone was not friendly. "Living in a hole like animals." Mary met his gaze without flinching. "We are warm," she said, and fed. Thomas laughed shortly. "Bitterly warm in an earth pit. That is foolish warmth. The deep cold will come. You will freeze. And the girl with you." The other men nodded, and one spat in the snow. Mary did not respond. She closed the hatch and descended, and heard their laughter fade as they walked away. Sophie looked up from the fire, her face questioning, and Mary shook her head. "It does not matter," she said. But that night she lay awake and listened to the wind howl across the surface, and thought about the men's words. She knew the deep cold had not yet come, and when it did, their shelter would be tested in ways it had not been before. She rose and added wood to the fire, then checked the seals on the walls and the draw of the flue. Everything was sound. She returned to the bed and lay beside Sophie, and did not sleep until the fire had burned low and the room had settled into its stable, insulated warmth. The deep cold came in the 4th week. The temperature above ground dropped so low that the air itself seemed to crack, and the snow took on a glassy, brittle appearance, crunching underfoot like broken glass. Mary climbed to the surface each morning and felt the cold bite through layers of wool and fur, numbing her face and hands. Within seconds, she worked quickly, gathering wood and checking the flue, then descended and sealed the hatch behind her below. The shelter held. The fire burned steadily, and warmth radiated from the stone hearth and tin panels, filling the room with a heat that was dry, and even the walls no longer wept condensation. The clay and wooden sheathing had sealed them, and the air was comfortable enough that Mary and Sophie could work without outer garments. Mary lined the bed with additional hides, rabbit furs sewn into a crude blanket, and at night they slept deeply, the cold unable to reach them through the mass of earth and layers of insulation. One morning Mary emerged and found the barn had partially collapsed under the weight of snow. The roof had caved in and the walls had buckled inward, but the hatch remained clear, protected by the angle of a drift. She stood and looked at the ruin and felt no fear. The barn had served its purpose. They had taken from it what they needed, and now it was returning to the earth. She gathered wood from the fallen beams and carried it below, adding to the stockpile in the corridor. That evening she and Sophie sat by the fire and ate soup made from the last of the squirrel meat and a handful of dried peas. The lantern burned on the small table, casting warm light across the stone vault, and Sophie held the doll on her lap, her fingers smoothing the yarn hair. Mary looked at her daughter and felt a quiet pride in her chest. The girl had not complained once and had worked without hesitation, learning each task and executing it with care. She was growing, Mary realized, not only in body but in competence and resilience. On the first day of the 5th week, Mary heard knocking again. She climbed the ladder and opened the hatch, and a woman stood in the snow, her face pale and her eyes red from tears. Mary recognized her as Sarah Fletcher, wife of Robert, one of the men who had mocked her weeks earlier. Sarah's hands were shaking, and her voice broke as she spoke. "Our chimney collapsed," she said. "The house is full of smoke. My children are coughing. I saw your smoke from the road. Please." Mary did not hesitate. "Bring them," she said. Sarah returned an hour later with her husband and 3 children, all of them shivering and red-eyed from smoke. Mary led them down into the shelter, and Sophie moved aside to make room by the fire. Without prompting, the Fletchers stood in the center of the room, their eyes widening as they took in the warmth, the light, and the careful construction of the space. Robert looked at Mary, and his face was full of shame. "I spoke ill of you," he said. "I was wrong." Mary shook her head. "It does not matter now," she said. She boiled water and made broth from the bones she had saved, adding a handful of dried beans and a piece of salt pork. She gave the children her portion, and Sophie did the same without being told. Sarah cried quietly and tried to thank her, but Mary raised a hand. "There is no need," she said. They stayed the night, the children sleeping on the floor by the fire. Wrapped in the furs Mary had sewn in the morning, Robert climbed to the surface and returned to his house to repair the chimney. Before leaving, he handed Mary a sack of flour, and she accepted it without pride or triumph. Sarah hugged Sophie, and the children waved as they climbed the ladder, their faces flushed from warmth when they were gone. Mary closed the hatch and descended, and she and Sophie sat by the fire in silence. The shelter was warm, the walls sound, and winter, though not yet over, had lost its power to frighten them. Mary added wood to the fire and watched the flames rise, and knew they had built something that would endure. Sophie leaned against her mother's shoulder, the doll clutched in her hands, and Mary wrapped an arm around her and drew her close. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside, the earth kept them safe, and the fire burned steadily, and they were home.